I'm Ndidi Spencer-Dias, creative director, TV presenter and mum. And I've taken time out of my schedule to bring you a series of documentaries based on Black 1919 Britain. Last year I was commissioned to write a play for the Black History Month Association, which I chose to write about the 1919 race riots which took place right here in Cardiff. Now, the response from those that came to see the play was phenomenal, but it became evident very quickly that at least 80% of them had never even heard of the 1919 race riots. How could such a violent outbreak have slipped into the shadows of Welsh history? So I decided to investigate it further. Not only to learn about the riots here in Cardiff, but the same riots that spread through the whole of Britain. Now, to find out where to start, I visited the Cardiff Story Museum. So do you have any information that pertains to the 1919 race riots specifically, or black people working in Cardiff?
Well, we do have some stories on the dock model about black people working in Cardiff. So this gives us lots of information about the different people that would have lived and worked in the docks. And Cardiff docks attracted many people from right across the world to work here because of the amount of coal exports that were leaving the ports, and that they went right across the world. Lots of people from across the empire would come to Cardiff to find work, and often many would settle in Cardiff as well.
And they'd come over on the tramp ships, would they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which meant they could come and go as they pleased.
Yeah, so for example, a ship could leave Cardiff with coal and go to Aden in the Yemen, and crew would go on the ships at that point, and then they would come back to Cardiff. So really, sailors from all around the world were coming back to
Cardiff, of course. So tell me what you found in your research. What did you find? What did your research reveal?
Right, well, it's multi-causal. There was certainly a strong element of racism. We'd seen that in the 1912 attacks on the Chinese in Cardiff. So there was this element of racism, and you could see it right the way through. Don't forget, slavery had only been abolished in 1833. It sounds a long time ago, but attitudes remain quite strong. Cardiff was a centre for tramp ships. What it meant was that seamen could get off these ships, they could find another ship very easily, there's no problem about that. But often they stayed over in Bute Town, maybe for a few days, maybe a few weeks, or maybe longer even. And of course, some of these people married white Welsh girls, and so you had mixed race at the docks, and this community was contained below the railway bridge from the Great Western, between the Glamorganshire Canal, and between the railway line, the Taffrail railway line. With the war, of course, many soldiers were called up. There was a shortage of labour then at the docks. And so the ship owners were keen to get labour from all over the world.
And I suppose because it was so easy to come and go as they pleased, it was easy for them to spend a lot of time here, and a lot of people did settle here.
That's right.
And fall in love with Cardiff,
That's
for which
right.
they had reason to.
I think the problems multiplied at the end of the war when you had soldiers demobilised. They came back.
And they wanted jobs.
They wanted jobs. They wanted housing. The house building had halved during the First World War. There was a desperate shortage of housing. They saw many of the workers on the ships, the maritime seamen, as taking jobs upon them. So you had these economic tensions as well,
Of course.
which were a factor. So underneath, you had all these things bubbling away. The spark that actually created the riot was there was what was called a break being a kind of posh cart that people went in drawn by a horse. And it contained both black men and white women. There was a crowd of people, soldiers, being demobilised, and they saw these coming back in this coach, and this break, and I think two things happened. One, they saw them as having money to be able to afford to go in these coaches, these breaks. And two, of course, it contained a mixture of black men and white women. That was the thing that sparked off 3 days of pretty serious rioting that resulted in deaths, a large number of injuries, and a large amount of damage to people's properties.
What a great place to start this journey. Visiting the Cardiff Story Museum, meeting Mike and Alison has given me a wealth of information. I'm now going to head over to the Glamorgan Archives and see if I can dig that little bit deeper into 1919 Cardiff. So I'm now taking a look through the fingerprint and photographic register of the police records, and all of the records that precede the riots have a fair mix of blacks, whites, men and women. But the instant you get to June, there is an influx of black males predominantly that have been arrested for shooting with intent, shooting with intent, shooting with intent, lots of shooting with intent. There's only one of them, Ali Muhammad, that was actually sentenced to 3 months in prison. The rest were discharged. On the following page, there's a Hassim Muhammad who was charged with shooting with intent and murder, but was later discharged. There were many black males who were handing themselves into the police, saying that they had caused these offences actually just to get refuge in the prisons, just to be arrested and taken off the streets because they feared for their own safety. This may have been the case with some of these, this may not, but there is a substantial amount of black men that are being charged with shooting with intent, rioting. Funnily enough, with the black men, it says shooting with intent. With all of the white people on the same pages, it just says rioting. What started as a research project for me has definitely developed into a personal journey of self-discovery. This is my heritage just as much as it's anybody else's. Not to mention, I'm married to a white Irish man with a daughter of mixed heritage. I mean, in 1919, both Irish and black people were oppressed here in Britain, and miscegenation was one of the driving factors of the riots. It's so important that my daughter doesn't grow up feeling disconnected in any way from her peers. I want her and so many others to discover their heritage and develop their sense of place. I've finally arrived in Glasgow, Scotland's largest city, famous for its fantastic arts and culture, and more recently for hosting the Commonwealth Games. Well, I would love to stop and soak in this culture, but I'm going to press on because I've got a very important guest to meet. Jacqueline, it is such a pleasure to meet you finally after studying your book for so long. It's been an absolutely fantastic resource in my research of the riots. But I have to ask, what do you believe were the driving factors of the riots?
It's no coincidence that the riots occurred in 1919, so immediately after the end of the First World War. And I think the social dislocation at the end of the war, people returning from war with high expectations and finding few jobs and housing that was overcrowded and hadn't been kept up in the course of the 4 to 5 years of the war. That's certainly one factor. The tensions that were building up with people with high expectations having fewer job opportunities helped cause the riots. But the riots all occurred in port cities. Yeah. And I think living standards had something to do with that too. And I think that those tensions, coupled of course with plain racism, led to the riots breaking out, because the riots were generally against racialised ethnic minorities.
So it's such a shame that there wasn't a harmony that was met after the war, and that it did lead to so much tension. And I just wanted to know what part you thought the state played in that.
I think the government perceived the sailors from the Caribbean and from West Africa as a problem, because there was these tensions. Rather than put money into the area or look at why there was unemployment in the Merchant Navy, they felt that if riots broke out, well, their role was to end the riots, and they did that by encouraging repatriation. In terms of official reaction, I think the police had a great part to play in creating the tensions in the communities and also in exacerbating those. So if there was a minor dispute, there would be mass arrest. For example, here in Glasgow, where 30 black sailors from West Africa were being attacked in their boarding house by a crowd of hundreds. They were all taken into protective custody but then charged.
And across the board, is it true that in the newspapers there was a lot of covering over going on?
Because the riots are relatively little known, the press coverage is the main source for riots all across Britain, and it is often a distorted version of events. One example would be Newport. The riot there was supposed to be caused by an insult made by a black man against a white lady, and just the sort of terminology used. Sometimes an evening newspaper would report a riot that had occurred that day in another location, and then a riot would break out in that particular place. So it seemed to be copycat violence because of the tone of the reporting.
And what we wanted to see is how Cardiff fared in relation to the riots that were going on around the rest of the country, and whether each city had its own driving factor.
Yeah, I think you could say that there were localised factors as well. And in fact, there was a large riot in George Square, the big municipal square in Glasgow, on the 30th of January, so exactly a week after the Seaport riot.
And that was very horrific, wasn't it? It was quite a horrific protest that
Yes.
Winston Churchill even had to let the armed forces come in to take control of that. Is that the one?
That's the one. They sent in thousands of troops and 6 tanks, and there was a mounted attack on the protesters.
And what about Liverpool?
Well, Liverpool had a very established black colonial community. They also had a very, very intrusive police force. There was a real distinct black community because the boarding houses and lodging houses and pubs were all within a very close proximity. So if people wanted to cause trouble, they knew exactly where to go. So I think that was the case, and it was also the case in Cardiff as well.
That's right. I was about to say in Bute Town, they there were only 3 ways in to Bute Town, and the police really did try to keep them in Bute Town.
Cordoned off.
Yeah. 4 people lost their lives in the riots. 1 in Liverpool, the rest in Cardiff. Were the Cardiff riots very intense, more so than the others, or was it literally the demographic of the 2 roads being closed off? There was only 1 way in, and therefore there was almost like a front line that was caused where all of this rioting took place.
I think it could be to do with the demography of the area, because if people are heavily armed, there are fewer places to escape to. Also, I think the police were quite hands-on, or batons on heads, in Cardiff, and there's there's one particular incident where a boarding house was being attacked, and yet the people, I think it was Arab sailors, 11 of them sustained head injuries, some of them fractured skulls, and the police couldn't say whether it was while they were fending off attackers or whether the attackers themselves had bludgeoned the inhabitants of the boarding house.
And now you're going to take us out onto the streets where the riots actually took place?
Yes, I'm going to take you out now to James Watt Street, which is the location of the merchant shipping yard in 1919, and I'll show you some of the warehouses and so on that still survive today, to give you a flavour of what the scene would have been like in 1919.
So this is the street that the riot started on?
Yes, in Glasgow this is James Watt Street. I think the numbering has changed. As you can see, it's a mixture of old and new buildings. There were 3 protest meetings in the space of a week, protesting about overseas sailors being hired onto British ships. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when a ship was in and people were trying to sign on for the ship, that's when the riot broke out. There was only 2 police in attendance, and they made their way further down onto the Clyde. Here you can see at the bottom of the street a number 118 Brumilaws, where the black sailors' boarding house was, which was attacked, laid siege to. Windows were broken, and that's where black sailors were rescued by the police. There was only 2 police officers in the area, the patrol police officers, trying to deal with the situation, until local business owners, probably people who ran these warehouses, phoned the central police station and said that there was a riot, and 50 police officers arrived.
But they couldn't control it either?
They couldn't control it either.
By that time it must have escalated so much that 50 police officers, they're not going to do much.
They couldn't do much, and that was why a number of people were wounded with knife wounds, and there was also some spent cartridges found in the black sailors' boarding house. So there was the allegation that they were firing down, and one of the white rioters was wounded with a bullet wound in the neck. The riots on the 23rd of January really started down there at the shipping yard, continued into the main British sailors' boarding house, and then along here to wherever the original building was of the black sailors' boarding house at number 118, which is somewhere along that way, but as you can see, there's nothing survives nowadays.
Well, thank you so much for coming out with me and showing me this. It's wonderful.
Very welcome.
Thank you. It's been an absolutely phenomenal day here in Glasgow. Meeting Jacqueline Jenkinson was just amazing and such an honour. You know, I've been studying her book for the longest while and pondering lots of things in my head. So to finally speak to her and find out what her views are, to hear it firsthand from her and to get into those discussions is just golden for me. When I spoke to Jacqueline about why not many people know about the race riots. She told me that she's working on a project at the minute to do with Belgians coming into Britain in the masses, and it was actually something I'd never heard of. So it's not necessarily just ignorance, it's pockets of history that do go untold until, of course, someone like me comes along and does something like this, wanting to unveil it for what it is and to just investigate it that little bit further. But right now, I think I better sleep.